These terms in here are really unclear, and I really would like somebody to explain. They're not defined anywhere. Who determines prevent imminent death or great bodily harm? And so let's say I am a victim of domestic violence, and I think, my perpetrator is going to kill me. Does imminent death, and in this word, say lasts only as long as immediately necessary to prevent the imminent death? So does that mean the person that my friend who can lend me a gun, has to be right there in the same room and see that there's imminent death coming? I mean, there is no definition here. And so it's unclear to me that this would help at all. Also, what is the definition of temporary transfer? How long is that? How long is temporary transfer? Does that mean, just enough time you can throw somebody a gun while they're imminently in death? I mean, you have to be right there. What does this mean? There's no definition. So if we're going to proceed with this, I think that we should at least define what these terms mean. And therefore, I really wish that my amendment that said that victims of domestic violence or sexual abuse that have an order of protection through the court, would be allowed to at least borrow a gun to defend themselves from maybe a friend. And so with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman from Arizona reserves the balance of her time. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, thank you, and I want to thank my colleague for advancing our discussion here, because I think now we're really starting to get somewhere. The gentlewoman suggested an amendment which allows for the transfer of a firearm to a victim of domestic violence or sexual assault who has an order of protection issued by a court. That's an extremely narrow exception. Most women who are enduring domestic violence don't have a civil protection order. Part of that is because of the incompetence of the laws in a lot of states, and part of it is because they haven't had the wherewithal to go get one. But our legislation and our amendment sweeps much more broadly. It allows any woman who is a victim of domestic violence, who faces a threat from their attacker, to be loaned a gun by a family member or be loaned a gun by a friend until the threat is resolved. But my friend suggests that there's something ambiguous about the words. I just don't see the ambiguity. Their original argument attacked the utility of all criminal law, saying we shouldn't have criminal laws essentially because criminals won't follow them. This seems like an attack on law itself. Law depends upon language, but the language is clear here, that if there's a threat, and if you're suffering from the threat of domestic violence, sexual assault, and so on, then you can get the gun. Who interprets it? Well, you've got the right to go out and get it. If someone were to prosecute you for doing that, the prosecution would clearly lose. So I'm afraid that our friends are looking for problems in this bipartisan legislation which simply don't exist. With that, I'm going to yield a minute to the gentlewoman from Texas, my friend Ms. Jackson Lee.
Gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
I ask to address the House for 1 minute. As a senior member on the Judiciary Committee and senior member on the Crime Committee, I too am glad of the underlying discussion regarding the protecting of women. But I rise today to support H.R. 8, the Bipartisan Background Checks Act of 2019, to close the gun show loopholes supported by 80% of the American people, so unlicensed dealers cannot undercover out of the back of their trunk sell to people who would create and perpetrate either mass murders or individual abuse and gun violence. I also support H.R. 1112, the Enhanced Background Checks Act of 2019, that would in fact have stopped the deaths at the Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina, where worshipers were shot down, 9 of them. To listen to the debate in the Judiciary Committee, 10 hours of rebuffing these simple legislative initiatives, I beg of my colleagues to stand with us. It is clear that we have an amendment, Horn and Murphy, that clarifies great bodily harm, includes domestic violence, dating partner violence, sexual assault, stalking, and domestic abuse. We want women to be protected and others involved in domestic abuse circumstances. My amendment that will be brought up as well will provide the information as to how many times the FBI have had to deal with petitions that have been denied. Let us not have another 20 years
Gentlewoman's time has
before
expired.
we have bills that deal with gun safety legislation. Let's do it now. I yield back.
Gentlewoman, time has expired. Gentleman from Maryland reserves the balance of his time. Gentlewoman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to refute some of the things or talk about some of the things said by my friends on the other side. One of the things that I do want to talk about is that Mr. Rascom said that my amendment is such a narrow exception for domestic violence victims, but yet I had a broader one in Judiciary Committee, if you remember, and the Chairman Nadler told me it was too broad, that I had to, it was too vague, and so that's why I made it very specific. If you'd like, I'd make it broad again. And also, in the Rules Committee, there was another amendment as well, and we're both on rules too, of course, and there was a broader one that said from Mr. Scalise, who is a victim of gun violence. He had an amendment that was ruled out of order, and that basically said that any victim of domestic violence, which was broad, but then he had another subsection that said victim of domestic violence or sexual abuse that has order of protection. So we covered both, yet it was ruled out of order. So we really tried. Now, the other thing that you brought up, that it's very clear what imminent danger means, and that would cover somebody, and surely, a domestic violence victim would not become a criminal under this law. Well, I don't think it's very sure. And so I asked Mr. Raskin, my colleague, if he would be open to removing the word imminent and just say danger instead of imminent danger, because to me, imminent danger means you have to be right in the same room, and throw somebody a gun or something. I mean, to me, the word imminent needs to be removed from the language. The other thing I'd like to talk about is that a number of times now, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have said, oh, so many people support this universal background check. Well, I disagree. I disagree because there's proof right in Maine. They had a ballot measure, and it was rejected by the majority of the people. So I just don't think, I suppose it depends on how you ask the question, but I just don't think that when you get into the details of how it takes away our fundamental Second Amendment rights and actually burdens law-abiding citizens and actually may harm people, some of these laws, like was the case with a young woman who testified in judiciary who said that good-intentioned gun laws actually prevented her from defending herself and she got raped. So I would say that there are some, in my disagreements with some of your statements. I also want to point out that there are many things that we can do on a bipartisan basis. And this obviously is not bipartisan, but I am the co-chairwoman of the Women's Caucus in Congress, and I have talked to my counterpart, who's a very nice woman and congresswoman, and we really do want to work on bipartisan solutions to gun violence. And I would say one of those is let's really concentrate on mental health issues. Now, we have done some things in the past. We did a Fix NICS Act, which we passed last year on a bipartisan basis, which really is an attempt to fix the national background system so that local jurisdictions actually report when there's problems, which I think is very valuable. We also did legislation in a bipartisan manner that would protect our schools more. And here's another thing we could do in a bipartisan manner. As you've noted, there was 3.5 million people have been stopped by NICS since 1994 from getting guns, and there was 112,000 were stopped just last year. But you know what? Only 12 of those 112,000 were actually prosecuted. Why? I mean, we have laws on the books now. We're not even enforcing them. So I think that's another thing we can do on a bipartisan basis. And again, this bill, I believe, does more harm than good. And I do think my colleagues are well-intentioned. I do believe that all of us, whether we're Republican or Democrat, want to reduce gun violence. And I reserve the rest of my time.
Gentlewoman from Arizona reserves the balance of her time. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. First, to clarify one thing, this is bipartisan legislation. We have at least 5 Republicans who are co-sponsoring and supporting this legislation, and I assume my friend doesn't mean to read those 5 Republican members of the House of Representatives out of her caucus. I'm not quite sure what happened in Maine, but I know that there are around a dozen states in the District of Columbia which have already gotten rid of the loopholes that we're going to get rid of today in this federal legislation. My friend also invokes Second Amendment rights. I thought that we had put that red herring to rest in 2008 in Heller versus the District of Columbia. Justice Scalia said that reasonable regulation to screen out felons and fugitives and the mentally unstable is perfectly consistent with the Second Amendment. So everybody on both sides of the aisle favors the Second Amendment along with the rest of the Bill of Rights. So you've got to, if you're going to oppose this legislation, you've got to base it on some public safety rationale and not pretend like anybody's made a constitutional argument, because nobody has made a constitutional argument. Finally, on the question of the domestic violence amendment, I would invite my friend to come on over, and we would gladly have unanimous consent to have her added to the amendment, which is the broader amendment she's talking about. Of course, her amendment was the narrow one, which required you to have a civil protection order before there would be an exception from the provisions of the legislation. She said she was misdirected by the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. All I can say is the legislative process is a treacherous place and a rocky road, especially for people in the minority. I've been dealing with that for several years. But in any event, we would love to have you join the amendment now. Mr. Speaker, I would make that offer to my friend. In the meantime, I yield 2.5 minutes to the gentleman from Massachusetts, who is the great and distinguished chairman of the Committee on Rules. Mr. McGovern.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. And I want to thank the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin, for yielding me the time. And I want to thank him for his leadership on this important issue. And let me remind my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who are opposing this legislation that people are watching this debate. And I know many are scratching their heads, wondering what's going on, because what we're trying to do here is close loopholes that allow violent criminals to get access to guns, not create more loopholes. Mr. Speaker, last Thursday I spoke at a town hall sponsored by students at Bancroft High School in Worcester, Massachusetts. Those young people demanded action on gun violence, not unlike other young people all across my district and all across this country. They are terrified, and they are tired of seeing one massacre after another, after another, after another, and they're sickened by the unacceptable high rate of gun violence in this country. We have an obligation to be on their side, not on the side of the gun lobby. In fact, most gun owners agree with what we're doing here today. 97% of gun-owning households support universal background checks. 97%. You just don't see that support. You don't see support like that on very many things. But on this issue, the public is speaking loud and clear. The question is whether Congress is going to listen. Now, my office has been flooded with calls on this year after year after year. And I've heard from loved ones of victims killed and from those injured. I know many of my colleagues can say the same thing. It's heartbreaking. And each of us is in a unique position. We can do more than just listen. We can act. We can actually vote to help save lives. Now, sadly, past majorities have turned a deaf ear. In fact, it has been nearly a decade since the Judiciary Committee held a hearing on a major bill to combat gun violence. When they were in charge, my Republican friends on the other side held a hearing instead on a bill that would have actually brought more guns from out of state into local communities. Their indifference on this issue of gun violence, their silence, has been stunning. But this majority is not satisfied with inaction. We will not be cowed by the gun lobby. We are moving legislation in the case of H.R. 8 that has been in the works for more than 20 years. The time for inaction is over. Listen to the young people in your districts. They are not content with a future where gun violence is the norm. They want and they deserve better. You know, last night in the Rules Committee, my Republican friends tried to pass exception after exception after exception. May I ask them for another 30 seconds?
Gentleman is granted 30 seconds more.
Gentleman is recognized for an additional 30 seconds.
They try to pass exception after exception to this universal background check bill, essentially trying to gut the bill. Well, this is a modest reform in the right direction. We are trying to save lives. We are tired of massacres. We are tired of comforting parents whose loved ones were killed in gun violence. We are tired of inaction. We are tired of the gun lobby dictating what Congress does and doesn't pass. This majority is going to be run by the people of this country, and the majority of the people of this country overwhelmingly support these bills. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to vote for this rule and vote for the underlying legislation.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves the balance of his time. Gentlewoman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman from Arizona reserves the balance of her time. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lee.
Gentlewoman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Congressman Raskin, for yielding for your tireless leadership. I rise today in strong support of the rule and H.R. 8, Congressman Thompson's bipartisan bill, which makes gun sale background checks universal. Now, this bill is an important step to ensure that individuals who should not be allowed to purchase a gun are no longer able to purchase a gun. Since 2014, nearly 400 of my constituents have died by gun violence. Our community feels their loss every single day. Here are just a few of their names and tragic stories. Davon Ellis. Davon was a star football player and an excellent student at Oakland Tech High School. He was shot and killed while walking home from school. My nephew was walking with him when he was gunned down. Trayvon Godfrey. Trayvon was killed in 2016 while sitting in a car with his friends in front of his home. Every time I think about Trayvon, my heart breaks. Trayvon came to a town meeting that I held on gun violence in January of 2016. Sadly, these heartbreaking stories are all too familiar in communities across the country. More than 30,000 Americans lose their lives to gun violence each year. Shootings now kill as many Americans as car accidents. And that's why this bill is so important. It's a good, may I have 30 additional seconds?
Yes, indeed. I will yield 30 additional
seconds. For an additional 30 seconds.
Thank you very much. This bill is a good first step to ensure that our background checks are strengthened and that we keep guns out of the wrong hands and that we close these loopholes. Mr. Speaker, we must end this epidemic of gun violence in our country. This is a national emergency. This bill will save lives. So I urge my colleagues to vote yes on the rule and yes on the bill. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves the balance of his time. Gentlewoman from Arizona is recognized.
I reserve the balance of my time, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Arizona reserves the balance of her time. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I will be prepared to close, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume. If we defeat the previous question, I will offer an amendment to the rule to make my amendment in order, which would allow domestic violence and sexual assault victims with orders of protection to be exempt from the gun transfer prohibitions. This amendment is crucial to saving lives. As a survivor of domestic violence, I know what it's like to be in fear for our lives. This common sense amendment is clear-cut. If you are a victim with an order of protection, you can borrow a firearm or transfer a firearm to you. It's important because victims don't often have the means to purchase or go pay for a background check. The Democrats have presented a letter from the National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence as a reason for not needing my amendment. However, with all due respect, the National Task Force does not speak for every victim, and they certainly do not speak for me. In fact, they never even contacted me, and I have been an outspoken person saying I'm a survivor of domestic violence since I ran for Congress. And I am also the person that sponsored the amendment to extend the Violence Against Women Act, yet they have never talked to me or reached out to my office. The majority offered a political amendment on domestic violence, which I've already talked about, which really does not do any good because the definitions of imminent danger are not defined and will not be carried out and will not be effective. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to insert the text of my amendment in the record along with the extraneous material immediately prior to the vote on the previous question.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, in closing, we all want to solve gun violence in the United States, but H.R. 8 and H.R. 1112 will not solve the problem. As co-chairwoman of the Bipartisan Women's Caucus, I am committed to working across the aisle on solutions we can all agree on. However, this is not one of them. We can talk about mental health. We can talk about strengthening the NICS background check system even more. We can talk about enforcing the laws that are already on the books. H.R. 8 will turn law-abiding citizens into criminals by making everyday gun transfers a crime and putting those that seek to protect themselves in jail for wanting to do so. H.R. 8 and H.R. 1112 will place an undue burden on citizens who already have a background check. For instance, security clearance, global entry, state-issued permits, etc. These pieces of legislation put law-abiding citizens in danger by disarming them and emboldening criminals. The bad guys never follow the laws. And in fact, I believe that this legislation violates the Second Amendment of the Constitution because it does not prohibit undue fees for this background checks, and thus someone could not afford them and thus not be able to get a gun to defend themselves. Mr. Speaker, I urge no on the previous question, no on the underlying measure, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from Maryland.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. Far from trying to turn law-abiding citizens into criminals, our legislation will save law-abiding citizens from criminals simply by expanding the successful Brady Law, which has been in effect for decades now. The gentlewoman introduces a constitutional argument at the last minute here saying that our legislation is unconstitutional because there may be undue fees imposed. Of course, those are the fees that are currently imposed under the Brady Law. So I'm afraid that my friend has just made an argument for the unconstitutionality of the current law, which has saved us from more than 3 million felons, fugitives, mentally unstable people, drug abusers, and undocumented aliens from acquiring firearms in the country. Mr. Speaker, our country is a social contract. I know we got a lot of young people here today. We are a social contract, and if you go back and read any of the social contract theorists, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Thomas Jefferson, any of them say we leave a state of nature, which is a state of war, and a state of violence, in order to live in a civilized way. But how civilized is it when tens of thousands of Americans every year are being killed in firearm violence? Every day, 100 Americans, another 100 Americans are killed with guns. In 2017, the highest level in 40 years, we saw nearly 40,000 Americans died from gun violence. That's not a civilized state. That's a state of war. That's a state of violence. And so we know what the loopholes are, and we're going to close the loopholes with this legislation, with our bipartisan legislation, which has support from Republicans. It has support from Democrats. The public opinion polls show that more than 95% of the American people support what we're trying to do here. Close the gun show loophole. Close the private sale loophole. Close the internet loophole. Make sure that everybody who purchases a gun in America is purchasing it only with the universal comprehensive mental and criminal background check. And we have amendments for the discrete exceptions that are necessary, including in cases of imminent violence, including rape and sexual assault. by domestic violence. We think that this legislation is excellent legislation that every member of Congress should feel proud in voting for. And with that, we submit to you both H.R. 8, the Bipartisan Background Check Act, as well as the bill to close the Charleston loophole so that criminals are not given guns after 3 days. We're able to delay that process in the event that more investigation is needed. And with that, I would yield back the remainder of my time, Mr. Speaker, and I move the previous question on the resolution.
The gentleman yields back his time. All time has expired, and the previous question has been moved. The question is on the previous question on the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I call
Gentleman
for,
from Arizona.
I ask for the yeas and nays to be counted.
Yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. Sufficient number having arisen. The yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 9 of Rule 20, this 15-minute vote on ordering the previous question will be followed by a 5-minute vote on adoption of the resolution 145. If ordered. And in addition, ordering the previous question on resolution 144 and adoption of House Resolution 144 if ordered. This is a 15-minute vote.